Good morning. Today I'm going to speak on the topic, Many Rivers to Cross, Gender, Elections Integrity and Accountability, Moving Nigeria Towards a Corruption-Free Election in 2023. As we all know, it's Womanifesto's 2022 conference, and today, October 24, 2022, it is my pleasure to be with you. I stand on all established protocols. So, to give a little bit of a background and context to what I'm going to tell you about today, when I sent the Zoom link for this event to a dear friend, she's a Nigerian scholar. She said to me, "Election integrity in Nigeria, indeed." I responded by saying, I am the idiot that's speaking on it, and followed up by reassuring her, or better yet, on its non-existence. What is the relationship between gender, elections integrity, and accountability in Nigeria? Are corruption-free elections possible in Nigeria? What would it take for us to have elections integrity in Nigeria? Can it be achieved as early as the 2003 elections? My answers to these questions are not encouraging. However, they are honest. I will first give brief answers to these questions. Next, I would give a broad context that draws upon studies, analysis, critiques, and commentaries on gender and election integrity. Then I will give a Nigeria context. Finally, I will try to offer some ideas on what could be done. So again, the first question, what is the relationship between gender, elections integrity, and accountability in Nigeria? My short answer is it's complicated. Nigerian women are caught up in a bad relationship with a socio-political system that is shaped by structural violence. I'm reminded of a comment made by Professor Bola Akonji during a presentation on gender and politics in Nigeria that I made at the University of Ibadan in 2019. She said that Nigerian women are in a Stockholm syndrome situation with our country because we are abused, but we have chosen to continue loving our country to our own detriment. Women are visibly marginalized in our political system. They are subjected to human rights abuses, including the denial of full participation in the system through the use of physical, psychological, sexual, and economic violence. And this is despite the constitutional and international obligations of the Nigerian state. So instead of having a situation where women's rights are affirmed and where there's commitment, there is violence against women in elections, and it continues as we speak. Are corruption-free elections possible in Nigeria? My short answer again is yes, but it would take lots of work by a critical mass of Nigerians. What would it take to have elections integrity in Nigeria? It would take comprehensive and fundamental social, political, and economic transformation. Genuine commitment to inclusive democracy is also necessary. But this is easier said than done. Democracy is about freedom. It's also about creating institutions that ensure that people enjoy freedoms that form the bedrock of democracy. And I have to say, our mantra should be, we who believe in freedom shall not rest until it comes. Therefore, a luta continua, Victoria Asserta must be our song. That is, the struggle continues, victory is certain. Corruption-free elections, can they be achieved as early as the 2023 elections? Not a chance, but we should continue the struggle. The challenges are many. The rot is too deep. And as Frederick Douglass, the African-American liberated enslaved person, said in his time, quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. Find out what a people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both," end quote. Now, on to this attempt to make sense of a conundrum: election integrity and corruption-free elections in Nigeria. Our country has had 6 general elections since our new attempt to democratize began in 1999. From then, there were elections every 4 years. We had elections in 2003, 2007, 2011, 2015, and 2019. In 2023, we will have the 7th. So far, 29 states and the Federal Capital Territory have followed the same schedule, while there have been off-cycle gubernatorial elections in Edo, Ondo, and Osun states, as well as by-elections for legislators in the National Assembly. The latter 2 categories of elections, gubernatorial and National Assembly elections, are due to voided elections in the states, and both voided elections and resignation, as well as deaths in the National Assembly, according to the Center for, according to CDD in their 2020 report. This is encouraging, the fact that we've had all these elections, because prior to 1999, we had long years of military rule. And we've been able now to have relatively peaceful transfer of power through elections in all the instances that I recounted. Believe me, I know that our elections have been deeply flawed with all manner of shenanigans. But the mere fact that we have managed to prevent coup d'etats is an achievement. And despite the overwhelming influence of incumbents in influencing the outcome of elections, we've also had cases of non-incumbents and their parties winning elections in our dear country. However, we must do better because in addition to other deep flaws in our elections, we have effectively developed a two-party system. Some states and local government areas are essentially dominated by just one party. Why is this a problem? The short answer is that elections should be unpredictable in their results. Again, something said by CDD in their 2020 report. And this is something that elections experts also tell us, unequivocally. Elections, according to Pippa Norris, should have this element of integrity. And the way she says it, electoral integrity concerns established global guidelines and requirements, principles and rules, as well as standards for the governance and administration of elections. For example, we're all familiar with the principle of free and fair elections. There are 6 guiding principles of electoral integrity that CDD produced. 1 is the respect for the principle of electoral democracy. 2 is ethical conduct. 3 is professionalism and accuracy. 4 is institutional safeguards. 5 is oversight and enforcement. 6 is transparency and accountability. It is well known that there are significant obstacles to women's political participation. Women's involvement in the electoral process is no exception. Women run for office, they vote, they cover the process as reporters. Some are electoral officers and non-governmental organization personnel who perform various functions during elections. And the larger political, social, and economic contexts within which they are embedded frame, shape, and either constrain or enable them to exercise their full rights of citizenship. This is according to Pippa Norris when she talks about strengthening electoral integrity. Also, the socio-cultural barriers to entry and functioning well in the electoral process are particularly powerful in either enabling women to exercise their rights or preventing them from doing so in any meaningful way. There are taboos, values, conventional practices, and behaviors that derive from historically patriarchal systems, such as the one we have in Nigeria, and these normalize the marginalization and exclusion of women from public exercise of power. In general, women tend to have less money than men and less social capital that enables them to take advantage of informal access to critical intelligence on what is going on in the political system in a timely manner. They also may face violence and discrimination. Finally, there are social and cultural norms that expect women to have responsibilities to their family. And those responsibilities are supposed to be prioritized over any public role that they're playing. This imposes, as many scholars of gender have said, a double burden, double workload on women. And they are therefore unable to devote their full attention to politics, particularly when they have young children or the family is in crisis. There's also the fact that the integrity of elections involves guaranteeing a free and fair process. So it is about time that the world embraces the idea that freedom and fairness in elections involves both an awareness of the barriers to women's full participation and a commitment to gender equality directed at effectively addressing them, that is, the barriers, during the entire electoral cycle, and in the political, social, and economic systems. Without determined, tenacious, consistent, and full commitment to gender equality and women's participation by all institutions and entities involved in the electoral process, or at least a critical mass among them, there'll be no significant change in the status quo. These actors include political parties, electoral management bodies, election monitors, courts, civil society, election observers, the media, international electoral assistance providers, and many others. Luckily, given the persistence of gender bias and discrimination in our world, this subject has attracted a lot of scrutiny, and there are many excellent opportunities to offer strategies that we can draw upon from best practices in other countries, including those in our continent, to promote gender equality throughout the Nigerian electoral process. I would like us to expand our definition of corruption to include both the normal understandings of what it entails concerning elections rigging, and doing what Nigerians have now come to accept as stomach infrastructure, intimidation, the use of violence, and otherwise subverting the process. I also include the persistence of bias and discrimination against women in Nigerian politics as part of corruption in the electoral cycle. The way I see corruption, it goes beyond the conventional definition. And now I'm quoting a source, which says that corruption goes beyond the conventional definition as abuse of public or entrusted power for private gain. Corruption is not a fixed set of practices, but rather an interpretive rubric that serves to make sense of and distinguish what is ethical and not, what is harmful or not, and what matters or not, and to whom in the ordinary processes of wealth accumulation and dispossession that define capitalism as we know it. Corruption is a capacious and slippery language put to a variety of opportunistic uses. Ironically, talk of corruption may be wielded by those who are most guilty of it. In some instances, corruption may also serve as a tool for progressive actors to critique capitalist forces. This is according to Antipode Editorial Collective in a 2019 book. So whatever we consider important in the electoral process, except for voting, Nigeria is doing extremely terribly on women's representation in our political system as decision makers and policy makers. Our statistics on women's political participation in the legislature are abysmal. Given notable improvements in women's participation in national parliaments worldwide, which presents us with an increase from 13.8% in 2000 to 24.3% in 2019. So the world has made the strides from 13.8% in the year 2000 to 24.3% in 2019. Nigeria is not doing well at all. So while for me, we should strive for gender parity, that is 50-50 of men and women in our political system across the board, it is impossible to deny that there's been a little bit of a change in a positive direction in the world. But Nigeria is an outlier. That is, it is outside of this trend because it began its newest foray into democratization in a positive direction. But it has normalized a precipitous decline in the percentage of women's political participation. So in Nigeria, we are in a struggle of gargantuan proportions. Hence, the title of my talk, Many Rivers to Cross. We do have many rivers to cross. Laws, regulations, and institutions that structure expectations of what we're going to have in our political system and should guide our behavior. They have significant impact on whether or not we achieve gender equality and increased women's political participation. The kind of electoral system we have matters. In situations where there's a desire to level the playing field and bend the arc of progress towards gender equality, temporary special measures, including quotas, are used to increase women's representation in order to address systemic, historical discrimination that render elections unfair and less than free. A lot of work that should be done is in our political parties, which tend to be patriarchal and resistant to women's equality in decision-making and in the exercise of power. Success in influencing them would increase opportunities for women to become more relevant in the political system. Women should be empowered with more capacity to influence the political system and process due to their presence around the table where important decisions are made. Political parties that embrace and enable internal democracy by mainstreaming gender through adoption of policies that support gender equality. They succeed in not only opening their doors to more women as members and candidates, they also demonstrate commitment to the success of the women candidates who run for elections as representatives of these progressive parties. and they have an influence on women who are elected and appointed to positions within the political system. Election management bodies can also embrace internal democracy by exploring multiple strategies that include women's political participation and gender equality in their institutions. There have been success cases in other countries, and these include, according to ACE, collecting sex disaggregated data, including gender equality provisions in their planning and internal policies, creating gender units or committees, seeking a balanced representation of men and women among electoral staff, and organizing capacity building initiatives in their external strategy. Election management bodies and other stakeholders can make efforts to promote gender equality and women's political participation at different stages in the electoral cycle that comprise voter registration, candidate nomination, voter outreach, electoral operations and procedures during election day, and dispute resolution mechanisms. From what I gather, INEC and possibly many state independent electoral commissions might claim to be doing all of the above. But really, are they? The measure of what they are doing is in the relevant actors in the political system attesting to the success of their efforts. Is this really the case? Election observation is important, and it has become a growth industry. It's important that international and domestic election observers are committed to gender equality, and they identify, examine, and contribute to eliminating obstacles to women's full participation in elections. They can mainstream gender into election observation in a thoroughgoing way, or focus on women's political participation in particular observation efforts. When observation teams are gender balanced, they both signal and demonstrate commitment to gender equality in principle and praxis. Their report and recommendations on the election should also incorporate gender equality and women's political participation as important elements. The media has a role to play, and its role is very important. We are all familiar with popular depictions of women in destructive and misogynistic ways, that is, women-hating ways, that enable, strengthen, and normalize objectification, authorization, and marginalization of women in politics and social relations. Efforts to introduce and strengthen media monitoring to contribute to documentation of discrimination against women in the media and evaluate the extent to which news coverage is gender sensitive is necessary. Training that builds the gender sensitive capacity of journalists and media experts contributes to better outcomes in fair and balanced reportage. Developing codes of conduct for media in elections provisions that include and emphasize gender equality, also reduces the likelihood of, quote, harmful stereotypes against women, and they integrate women's voices into the public debate, according to ACE in a 2022 report. Violence against women in elections militates against women's ability to enjoy their political and electoral rights. And there are various ways in which this kind of violence is manifested, quote, including harassment, intimidation, psychological abuse, sexual violence, and physical attacks directed to women with different roles in the electoral process, such as voters, candidates, party supporters, observers, electoral administrators, or public officials. This is according to ACE 2022. Eliminating or at least reducing violence against women in elections would require all hands on deck. And all stakeholders in the electoral process must pursue multi-pronged preventive and mitigation strategies and mechanisms in all aspects of the electoral cycle. Violence against women in elections should be documented, mapped, and measured. Election observation should include monitoring. And also, legal and policy reforms are necessary. Specific electoral procedures should be adopted to mitigate violence. Political parties should commit to ending violence against women in elections, and there should be public education geared towards ending violence in the electoral process. Globally, democratic space is visibly shrinking. Right-wing parties and anti-democratic sentiment are on the rise, even in established democracies. And also there are ill winds that bode no good to the fundamental principles and values of democracies and the rights that they are presumed to guarantee, such as freedom of speech, freedom of association, the right to peacefully gather and protest against state encroachment on the rights of citizens. It is even more important that civil society organizations push for gender equality and inclusiveness in politics and the electoral processes. We should be encouraged that there are many examples of successful advocacy by women's NGOs and organizations contributing to both social change and increased women's political participation. And this includes efforts made by our NGOs here in Nigeria. But there is need for more work. Part of the strategies that have been found to be successful elsewhere, including identifying and collaborating with men as allies in the work of achieving gender equality and inclusive democracy. Trust me, I'm aware that some of this is going on in Nigeria, where people are working with he's for she's, and it is commendable that these efforts are being made, but as I would like you to know that I have been saying, whatever we're doing is still not enough. We need to do more. Thankfully, the frenzy of electioneering usually ends, and this happens when there's success in picking a candidate as the new incumbent. after the election. So what then happens after elected officials are identified and they are affirmed as having won these electoral contests? The experiences that have been had during elections should inform corrective measures and their prioritization in the post-electoral period. So, in the legislatures, there's a key role to play in the struggle for gender equality and increased women's political participation. The strategies that have been found to be effective include passing and enforcing, implementing affirmative action laws, quote, effective oversight of government policies, and strengthening parliamentary structures to promote equality and women's rights. This is according to ACE in the same 2022 study that I have cited previously. So Nigeria needs to work on full inclusiveness of women and other categories of people that we have marginalized, including, so we have laws that say our Constitution guarantees full equality and equal participation, but we discriminate against the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex community, or the LGBTQI community. Without broadening gender equality to fully include this population, democracy is incomplete, according to the International Parliamentary Union in a 2019 study. So those are my short answers. And I still think there's need to expatiate. And I again want to ask these questions. So we will continue this in the next segment. Thank you so very much for listening to me and for giving me your undivided attention. We will continue later with part 2.